Hello, beautiful community. We'll get in the coming videos to the escalation in the Middle East and Iran's retaliation and the Trump administration's spectacular incapacity to plan even 2 or 3 steps ahead, or even talk about a plan 2 or 3 steps ahead. But now I want to talk to you about something really important beyond the UK. And it's the 9th anniversary of Brexit today. And we'll do an interesting experiment, the value of which for you and us and me is this. All this stuff is partly local, the global wave of loss of trust in institutions, and mostly global. Partly local, mostly global. That's why when I have incredibly thoughtful emails about Donald Trump from US citizens who point out that Trump is a unique phenomenon, funnily enough, having a deep sense of American politics but not understanding the politics of at least 2 or 3 other countries actually means you can't have a deep sense of politics, because Trump is more a global than a local phenomenon, right? He is a global phenomenon with local thrills, largely because as soon as you begin to do a sociology of Trump, the idea that that sociology of the causes of Trump, the idea that that sociology isn't globalized just becomes just farcical, right? I mean, you basically just need to sort of exit intellectual reflection in the world to avoid that conclusion. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put up the piece I wrote, which is just 9 claims, and I'm going to react to them as 2025 Vlad reacting to 2016 Vlad. 2016 Vlad will be humiliated in this exercise or affirmed as being really of very similar disposition and articulation as the current Vlad. So let's give this a whirl. Point 1. Categorizing white working class people as racist and stupid is an ethical disaster, and in the light of Brexit, a political disaster. Now, of course, we're already entering an age of hyper-identity politics in 2016, and we're already seeing its counterproductive consequences. That's what I'm referring to. And I think that there are 2 important distinctions that I think help us with this claim that I made, with which I still agree. The first is that there is a difference between a private reckoning with racism and a public reckoning with racism. And here I'm inclined to agree with wonderful colleague Mark Lilla in his thought that if you're going to make a case for BLM, for instance, you're going to be able to make a much stronger case that they offered resources for a private reckoning with racism than that they offered resources for a political reckoning with racism. So don't conflate the two, right? A certain kind of movement can help with one, but not the other. Second distinction is that a private definition of racism cannot be a definition that we use in politics. In private, we can get philosophical. We can talk about how everybody is a little bit racist. And we will have these conversations maybe on the Philosophy channel. But you can't say that in politics. Politics requires simple concepts, concepts that work in a way of a football that's thrown around from one person to another, right? It's not a fragile, vase made of crystal that can fracture. It's a hard, fairly solid object you can throw about without it losing its integrity. That's the kind of definition of racism you need in politics. Basically, it needs to be a very minimal definition of racism when it comes to reliance on metaphysical, literary theory, philosophical resources. If your political definition of racism requires somebody to read Derrida, you've got probably nonsense, or generously putting it, a private definition of racism that might be philosophically interesting, but it ain't gonna work in politics. Point 2. that I made, the UK Labour Party is ill. It has an inadequate relation to its own past. The Blair years have not been processed, but evaded. It's as though they didn't happen. We often talk about how Russia is a spectacular example of a country that relates to its past as though it didn't happen, as though it's a kind of a cipher onto which various kinds of convenient things in a somewhat postmodern way can be projected. Well, that's the Labour Party's relationship with its past. It hasn't properly asked, what does Tony Blair mean to us? What does Gordon Brown mean to us? What does Alistair Campbell mean to us? What does the Iraq War mean to us? What does the domestic politics of the Third Way mean to us? What was the Third Way? What's its relation to the kind of neoliberalism that has historically proven to be a cause of the authoritarian populism we are seeing? So if Labour had reckoned with its past more, then the Keir Starmer government today would be less defensive, less reactive, less fearful, and less in a kind of bogus safety retreat into technocratic centrist solutions that are progressively out of touch with small majorities or large minorities of the population. 3, we're going to zing Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I have memories of Jeremy from the anti-war movement in 2002, for example. So Jeremy's got skills. What Jeremy doesn't have are the kind of leadership skills that a national leader should have. So let's get to Jeremy. Point 3, the logic of Jeremy Corbyn's platform, though not its intent, was always Brexit. Its politics is incompatible with capitalism as we might construe it on EU terms, and incompatible with UK's continued membership of the EU, and I rather agree with that still. Point 4, Corbyn is humour colourblind. That's sort of point that Martin Amis rightly made about him, and is incurious about the world. And that's a psychological failure. Politically, we're talking about the ex-leader of the Labour Party, of course, here. Politically, Corbyn speaks to a world that isn't there, and that's illusion and delusion, actually, right? Bernard Williams used to say that, one of my hero philosophers, that illusion is thinking that the world in the future could be something it can't be, and delusion is thinking that the world today is something that it is absolutely not. So it's very important that Jeremy Corbyn is not the British Bernie Sanders. In other words, it's consistent to think of Sanders constructively and Corbyn unconstructively. And there's a kind of parochial prejudice in the US to think that Corbyn is the UK version of Bernie Sanders. They're very different. It's entirely possible to think that Bernie Sanders is more positive than negative politically, or overwhelmingly positive, while thinking that Corbyn is overwhelmingly negative. Whatever you think of them, they're very different political actors with very different skills, and indeed different policy positions too. 5, large-scale societies are not to be expected to agree on demonstrable matters of fact. And here, the late philosopher Alistair MacIntyre can join us briefly in spirit, because Alistair loved to say that that matters of fact, that are matters of fact in a flat sense, not sort of facts that require a lot of evaluation, shouldn't be controversial in a modern society, but they inevitably are. 6, the second goal of politics is to make the world a better place. The first goal is to keep the show on the road. Now, I don't know what I meant by that. I think I probably meant by that whether you get a Remain or a Brexit outcome might be a matter of tragedy, but in the scheme of big historical perspective, it's not going to be a matter of deep tragedy, right? Both outcomes are going to be livable, and the negative outcome, because I favor the Remain, for me, Brexit, because I lost the referendum, was going to be bad, but not catastrophic. 7. There are two kinds of nationalism, a benign one and a xenophobic one. Mocking the former fuels the latter. And I'm still very persuaded about this, because progressive politics needs to abandon hyper-identity politics and focus on a kind of patriotic liberal nationalism that centers a bond of solidarity between all citizens. 8. The welfare state aims at solidarity but reproduces division between citizen and stranger. What I meant by this is that as liberal democratic welfare states become less ethnically homogeneous, they lose trust in the very institutions needed to sustain a welfare state. 9. Brexit puts in doubt the European project and its survival into the next decade. Well, it's surviving into the next decade. If that sorrowful scenario comes about, it'll be a case of the world refusing to be what we need it to be. And what I probably meant by that is that there is so much that you simply cannot do without the infrastructure of EU institutions. Various kinds of climate policy. You simply cannot do going it alone. But what do I now think about my skepticism about the EU here? It's a reluctant skepticism. So I'm not saying that I want the European Union to decline. I don't. The opposite. But what's my sense of the historical tendency? I think my sense of the historical tendency in 2025 is that the European Union is not on course for collapse, but it's on course for progressive incapacity and delegitimation, such that there won't be an overnight situation where we'll say it's collapsed, but there will be years in the decade to come, perhaps, I'm moving it forward one more decade now, where we'll say, possibly, is the European Union still working, or has it ground to a halt? Thank you so much for being with me. We'll talk about the Middle East soon. Lots of love.